In 2004, I wrote an article called Illegal Drugs in a national level magazine called Context. And in that article, I reviewed public opinion about legalizing drugs, but especially marijuana. And at that time, only about 34% of Americans believe we should legalize marijuana. Fast forward to the 2020s, and that number goes up to double that. So what happened in that time period? Now, it may seem like a long time to you, but 20 years is not a lot of time in humans, for humans. We don't change that quickly usually, but something happened that people as a whole changed from a no to a yes. In this chapter, we're going to explore how society impacts your thought processes. Did you know that most research shows that people are more positive about local politicians than they are national level politicians? This is important because a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the social construction of attitudes and behaviors comes from the idea that when we interact with something on a regular basis, we think differently about it than if it's something abstract. You might hold a general belief or a value that all politicians are untrustworthy. However, if you have direct positive experience working with a local politician on a community project, say, direct experience, your specific attitudes toward that politician might become quite favorable, even if your general value remains. This section really pushes us to consider that attitudes are fluid, interactive creations rather than static entities stored in our minds. The interactionist perspective reminds us that our feelings and evaluations are constantly being negotiated, like the entire concept of the social construction of reality. The emphasis on direct experience over pre-existing beliefs is particularly insightful. It suggests that exposure and interaction can be powerful forces for change, sometimes overriding deeply held convictions. I want to stress the challenge of studying public opinion is that sometimes we have strongly held opinions, sometimes we put them under the category of values, but we also have things that are not very strong, and we have non-attitudes. And when we're asked our opinion about something, we will give our opinion even if we really don't have a strong belief about it. And that's going to make a huge difference on whether that belief, value, or opinion impacts our behavior in any way. I tell my children all the time, do as I say, not as I do. And it's kind of a running joke in our family. And the idea is that clearly a lot of us do things that don't necessarily reflect what we really think about the world, our values and our beliefs. And why is that? I feel really bad for pollsters. I've done a lot of research in my career, and a lot of it's been survey research. And it's very difficult to predict people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It's very difficult to predict from a thought in a survey what they're going to do. They say they are going to vote for somebody, and then they go vote for somebody else. So on the one hand, this could simply mean that humans are totally unpredictable. But if humans were totally unpredictable, trust me, we wouldn't wake up in the morning and get through the day. So the real question is, why aren't they as predictable as they say they're going to be? And why is there this gap between our thoughts and what we actually do? I want to say on the research side of things, it could simply be poor measurement, that we don't know how to do it. And I do know there's some psychological studies under very exacting conditions, they can predict with over 90% certainty what you're going to do. But they have to collect so much data, it's not useful for you and I in our day-to-day lives. On a regular basis, that is, if you go around and ask people what they think about something, you're only going to predict their behavior maybe 30% of the time. The average relationship between an attitude and behavior is about a 0.3. So if you built bridges on this, then the majority of the bridges would be falling down. It's not very useful. I'm going to bring in our old friend agency, and it's very important. This is the beginning of the class. We talked about some fundamental ideas about humans. Humans have agency. And so maybe in a particular moment you're thinking one way, but then when you go to actually do whatever it is you're thinking about, you consider all the other factors that go into it, not just your opinion, but everything else involved in it. You want to purchase something. Well, then you have to start thinking, I really want it. That's a stable thought about it. But then there's costs. And if I do buy that, I'm not going to be able to do other things with that money because I'm putting it into that. You might start thinking about what other people think about buying that product. There's so many other factors that get in the way. And you can just change your mind. And that is something that is very human as well. So on the one hand, yes, there is a gap between our attitudes and behavior. Keep in mind, though, that's also, in my opinion, what is special about being a human being. Now, a lot of this class is going to focus on inequality. I told you at the beginning of the semester, that's what sociologists spend a lot of time doing. And with attitudes, we're going to focus on prejudicial attitudes. But I'm going to start us off with this discussion on a positive note. And it helps to understand that the lack of coherence between our attitudes and behaviors actually can be a good thing. Consider Richard Lapierre's famous study from the 1930s. He traveled with a Chinese couple in the U.S. during a time of significant anti-Asian prejudice. He then surveyed establishments asking if they would serve Chinese guests. Almost all of the hotels and motels said no. Yet, when the couple actually visited these places, only one refused service. This classic study demonstrated that prejudicial attitudes do not always translate to discriminatory behavior in real-world social interaction. In this case, the gap between attitude and behavior was a good one. In its most recent findings, Gallup polls shows that 67% of Americans believe race relations in America are bad. Prejudice seems to exist, and we recognize it's a problem. So why does it continue even though the majority of us think it's a bad thing? One reason we may not see a great relationship between attitudes and behavior when it comes to race and prejudice is that there are different types of racism. Conscious racism is hard to study because very few people want to admit to it. The last I've seen anything on this, has been many years, is that less than 5% of Americans admit to any kind of openly racist attitudes. However, there is ideas associated with racism called unconscious racism and institutional racism. Unconscious racism includes biases that we hold without being fully aware of them. A famous example of someone who tried to study this is the Bogardus social distance scale, in which he asked people not directly whether they're racist or not or had certain biases, but rather how close people feel to people of different backgrounds. And he included things like Canadians, American English, but also Asians and Black individuals. And no surprise, the majority felt a little closer to Canadians, Americans, and English than they do to Asians and Blacks. In fact, people of Black descent from anywhere almost always would be on the lower end of that scale, suggesting there is some sort of a bias going on, even if people are not conscious of it. Institutional racism, on the other hand, deals with practices that ultimately lead to racist outcomes through those practices and procedures. Probably the most common example of this would be that African Americans in the U.S. have a harder time getting loans, business loans, and personal loans than white and Asian Americans. A similar set of logic can be applied to the study of sexism in society, where most people are not overtly sexist in any way. There could be subtle forms of sexism that exist in the way that men and women interact with each other. There's really only two things I really don't want to focus on here. One is the idea that we may have an attitude toward a behavior or an object or anything else, but we also incorporate the norms of the people around us and the larger society in deciding whether to act on those thoughts. I also want to point out that psychologists really emphasize the idea that there's a gap between our attitudes and behavior, and that's the intention to do something. And that is, our attitude may give us a disposition towards something, but there's a huge gap between whether we act on that disposition or not. And that gap comes from circumstantial things that are happening right in front of us that may stop us from acting on a decision that we made. So we might decide we want to go purchase some object, but on our way, life happens, something interrupts us, and we aren't able to do that. So it stops us midway. And any number of things in life could stop us from acting on those things that we want to do. So our attitudes are really in some ways averaged based on our thoughts about things, as well as the thoughts of the people around us, the larger society. And some things are weighted more heavily than others. So our family opinions might mean more to us than, say, the public news or something like this. But we incorporate all of those things into ultimately what we decide is important to us. So where do we get our attitudes in the first place? At a very young age, we are interacting in the world, but we certainly don't have the language skills early on to clearly form thoughts and beliefs about the world. Generally, it's believed that socialization processes work with attitudes just like everything else in life, that we observe people around us and take in those attitudes. But as we talked about in our socialization chapter, children do have agency, and they coordinate their thoughts with the people around them, and they interpret adult values and beliefs into their day-to-day interactions with peers. And it's generally believed we continue to do this throughout our life. I would say the major difference between what children experience and what adults experience is the role of media in our attitude formation or attitude change over time. I will add another important thing to be aware of is that sociologists study the role of our social positions in forming our attitudes. We know from some research that the status of our families impacts our attitudes above and beyond the interactions in the family themselves. Just being born into one family versus another, typically I'm talking about working class, middle class, and upper class, can influence your attitudes, again, above and beyond the actual socialization processes that go on in the family. Much to talk about here. It can be rather overwhelming, but it's some things I think I need to stop and slow us down and talk about. First, I want to stress that there's a lot of talk about media and its influence on our lives. And in terms of attitudes, I want to put media in there with friends and family and so forth. If you remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked about primary, secondary, and reference groups. And in that sense, we can put media in the category of reference groups. These are groups that influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in the world, but we don't necessarily interact with them on a regular basis. Probably the most famous person in this area was Marshall McLuhan, who talked about the median is the message. I almost said the word massage because his original book had misspelled message and put massage there by mistake. Similar, Altide's book on media syndrome is similar, and the idea is that the internet, instead of TV and radio back in McLuhan's day, is serving to influence our attitudes above and beyond our peers and our own education. So I want to add a couple of other things that are important for you to understand as you think about attitudes and behaviors the rest of your life. First is the sociological model of attitudes and identity. And the idea is that identity impacts our behaviors, and it relates to attitudes in this way. And that is, picture two people. Both of them say that they have an attitude that the environment is very important to them. They took a survey on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being most important, and they both scored a 5 on that. And then you try to predict whether they're going to actually give money toward, trying to fix problems with the environment or volunteer or something like that. But what if you found out one of them already is a volunteer in an environmental group or actually gets paid to work in an environmental group? Which one do you think is going to actually act on that attitude more? Probably the one who already has that identity. And so identities help us to understand how attitudes create identities in the first place. But once we have those identities, we try to stay consistent, going back to chapter 5 on status consistency. Finally, I want to mention balance and cognitive dissonance theories, and that these are old psychology ideas that we try to coordinate our feelings about the world based on our past thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and the thoughts, feelings, and behavior with people around us. And we try to make them all commensurate with each other. And sometimes that doesn't happen, and that we have an attitude that conflicts with other people or our previous way of thinking about things, and that causes distress. And then we either have to go back to the way we used to think about things, or we change our attitudes. But we are constantly in this state of flux as we take in new information from people, the media, and everything else around us, and make decisions about what we think going into the future. We're going to look at two ways that group processes focuses on the role of group interactions in forming attitudes toward ourselves and other people. Status construction theory is the idea is that we develop attitudes toward people partly based on their status in groups. In some cases, it's the status they develop in groups. We talked about social exchange theory and how people who contribute more to a group, or at least perceive to contribute more to a group, are given more status. In other cases, we bring their statuses from the outside world into the group. Typically, we focus on race, class, and gender when it comes to sociology, but it could be their looks. It could be their prestige from the community. They might have a high status position in the community, but they bring that into the group. And so regardless of the performance of the group, they get a little extra bonus positive feeling from people simply by having that. And if they continue to exchange more in their group, give more to the group, then that supports their initial perception that they have coming into the group. A second way that group processes helps us understand the impact of group behavior on our thoughts, feelings, and behavior is through social identity theory. Here we're focusing more on the in-group versus out-group. This is a fairly well-studied thing that however you define your in-group, typically it's again your friends and your family, but it could be your reference groups, the people who are important to you even if you don't interact with them. We tend to not only look at them more positively, but even when they do something bad, we find ways of defending those behaviors as well. So it might be that you're a staunch Democrat or Republican and somebody in your party does something bad, but you defend that behavior in one way or another. You justify it. And that way, with the my side bias, the bias we have toward ourselves, is applied to our in-group. After reviewing materials from this section, you have to ask yourself, can you ever have an authentic set of beliefs amidst this chaos of everyday life with family, friends, and the internet? We now even have something called sloppers, people who rely on AI to tell them what to do. My advice is be intentional. You can use your agency to think what you want to, act how you want. That said, don't be afraid to lean on what you know to be true. It is okay to conform every once in a while. Of course, occasionally you're going to have to stand up in front of a group and stand your ground. But go into that knowing who your in-groups are, your out-groups are, and in terms of status construction theory, what statuses you bring in that may help you or in some cases may hurt you. And together, these things might help you be more effective in that situation.